Welcome to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. Each week, we interview top experts in physical therapy, pain science, and integrative pain care. You'll learn the most up-to-date information for treating and reversing persistent pain. This podcast is for educational purposes only and not intended to be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Joe Tatta.
Hey there, friends. Welcome to this week's episode of the Healing Pain Podcast. This week, we are discussing trauma-focused care. Trauma is an event or a life circumstance that is experienced by an individual. It can be physically or emotionally harmful. It can be life-threatening, and it can have lasting adverse effects on an individual's function, which includes their mental, physical, social, emotional, as well as spiritual well-being. If you work in the pain recovery space, you'll recognize that there are high rates of comorbid chronic pain, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder or trauma. In the context of chronic pain, this is often experienced as medical trauma. However, we shouldn't ignore early life childhood experiences, the distress that we experience as adults on an ongoing daily basis, or even how entire communities or populations can be exposed to a traumatic event. Here to speak with us today about trauma-focused care is Dr. April Gamble. April is a licensed physical therapist who has been living and working full-time in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. They have 10 years of experience in community-driven efforts to develop equitable rehabilitation services with an emphasis on persistent pain, mental health, trauma focus, and interdisciplinary rehabilitation. April serves as principal investigator for funding efforts, research activities, and program development on initiatives in the United States, Kurdistan, Federal Iraq, and the greater Middle East, North Africa region. April is also the founder and director of ACR, which aims to develop community-driven efforts to develop equitable rehabilitation services. They are also the physiotherapy director at Wu Chun. That's an organization for human rights violations where they lead the development of treatment services for survivors of torture and war trauma. Just a quick show note before we begin. This is the last episode of the Healing Pain Podcast for the year 2022. I want to take this time to thank you for tuning in each week with us here at the Healing Pain Podcast and supporting the work that we do to educate people and raise awareness around safe and effective ways to recover from chronic pain. I wish you and yours a happy and a healthy holiday season, as well as a prosperous new year. We will return with a new episode of the Healing Pain Podcast on January 4th of 2023. Stay tuned. Okay, without further ado, let's begin and let's meet Dr. April Gamble and learn about trauma-focused care. Hi there, April. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Healing Pain Podcast. It's great to be with you today.
Thanks, Joe. I'm happy to be here.
People were introduced to you in the introduction I read. So they have a kind of a full picture of your bio and what you're about, the things that you're interested in professionally and personally, and of course, your credentials. Give us an idea of how you kind of approach, who you are and your professional identity to the patients that you're working with who are working through trauma in a trauma-informed way.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I think I'll read I call it like a personal statement that I've crafted. And it's something I always kind of come back to because I feel like in our profession, we often, introduce ourselves with credentials and this is what I do. But the way I think about it is what we bring into the work is what matters, right? And we bring our own cultures and backgrounds and experiences. So I'll just read a short little statement that I think represents who I am so folks can understand that a little more. So I was born and raised in Michigan as a descendant of European immigrants that traveled to the States, like so many before and after, with the hope of a better life. I respectfully acknowledge that my birthplace is seized territory of the Anishinaabe. The wealth, power, and advantages that I experience, including where I live now in Kurdistan, Iraq, are the result of colonization, ableism, and the enslavement of Black people. The unearned opportunities that I have as a white American come at the expense and suffering of many. I am taking responsibility for this and for my role in upholding systems of oppression. My work as a physical therapist is embedded in my core belief that we can create a world where justice is the reality for all. I lean into experiences of discomfort so I can come equipped to mobilize effectively under the leadership of those that face oppression every day to revolutionize rather than retreat. I will make mistakes. I will unintentionally oppress and silence. I know that it is the impact of my actions that matter. So I create and engage with a community of accountability. As my own healing, freedom, and opportunities are intimately interconnected with those of every human and our planet, I do not come to save or heal or fix. I come to bear witness, a quiet daily recognition so different from the desire to repair. I strive to create a space where differences are celebrated, where collaboration breeds growth and healing, where acts of resistance to assimilation and oppression are embraced, and where a new way of being can be imagined within ourselves, our clients, our profession, our organizations, and our communities. Thanks, Joe, for letting me share that.
Thank you. I'm just going to let that just sit for a moment for ourselves and for everyone else who's listening and watching, because I think that is something that's extremely new for, I would say, the vast majority of physiotherapists or physical therapists to hear coming from a colleague's mouth, basically, in a first person. I want to thank you for it. It's obviously a brave step forward for our profession. And for people who follow along with me every week, I'm always looking for brave voices, voices to not only try to support and uphold the things that I'm doing and my perspectives, but also people who have a bigger vision for our profession and who we are as professionals. So I thank you for that. Obviously, wrapped up in that introduction that you provided with us is a lot, right? This is not something that you just typed up yesterday because you were going to sit down and talk with me on a podcast for about 45 minutes or so. So give us an idea of how this all started to develop in you as a person.
For me, it's a long journey. And I think it doesn't have this, one moment and it's clear, concise narrative and story, right? Which is the reality when we do transformation work within ourselves. So even that process of writing a personal statement like that is an ongoing thing where I keep embedding different aspects of my own work and transformation into it. And a lot of that is embedded within the topic we're talking about today, trauma-focused physiotherapy, because trauma is related to injustices and it's connected to how we move in the world.
And give us an idea now where you're currently in Michigan, but the capacity in which you work and serve people today and where that all takes place.
So I live full-time in Kurdistan, Iraq, which is the northern region of Iraq, in the Middle East, or Iraq, as Americans say. And I've lived there for over 6 years. I've lived outside the US now for over 10 years. After my doctorate and residency, I moved outside of the US. And so I am freelance, which means that I have the wonderful opportunity to work alongside different communities, organizations, both in my community in Kurdistan, but also in the community in the US and a global community as well. So a lot of what I do is mental health physical therapy, trauma-focused physical therapy, and then also development of rehab services. So working with communities to strengthen their physical and mental health rehab services in a variety of settings.
And was this something that you discovered while you were in physical therapy school, or was it something that was an idea even before you went through your DPT program?
No, I definitely didn't know it was a thing during physical therapy, right? I mean, even the concept of trauma wasn't talked about in physical therapy when I was a student. I don't know if it is now.
Yeah, I mean, the two things that you mentioned there, mental health physical therapy, or physical therapy and mental health, however you want to look at that, and trauma focused or trauma informed care. And I can tell you, because I, work in this space a lot, really is barely spoken about at this point in DPT education. It does exist in some schools in some way, but not to the degree of your life and professional experience that you have today.
Yeah, exactly. Like for me, it was a lot of just professional development along the way, working alongside colleagues that are mental health professionals, counselors, psychologists, having my own clinical supervision by, often I couldn't find a mental health physical therapist. So I would have clinical supervision by a counselor or some other mental health professional to help support my development.
Yeah. And that can be difficult right there, actually. Because I've been through similar pathways where in one sense, when you start working, if you have the opportunity to be kind of peer led by a mental health professional, it's interesting because it opens up your world to, how they think and how they approach things. And that's wonderful. And at the same token, the way I felt, I'm not sure if you felt the same way, and I'm interested in hearing your experience. At the same token, you then still have to take the interaction and the learning that you're exploring and receiving with them, and then start to mold it to your own practice, because oftentimes I also found that they aren't quite sure what we do and how some of the techniques or interventions that they have could kind of parlay into what we're doing as professionals.
Yeah, that's true. I've definitely experienced the benefit of having colleagues and supervision with physios going through similar professional journeys of conceptualizing mental health physical therapy, trauma-focused physio, and also other mental health providers. Because for me, it's a lot of taking what exists within our profession, like modern pain science, polyvagal theory, basic body awareness therapy, and kind of conceptualizing, developing those skills, and then conceptualizing it and integrating it into a treatment designed for survivors of trauma.
So how do you describe trauma-focused physical therapy? And, we can be very heavy on terms in this podcast. So there's trauma-informed care. So there's, for me, at least the way I'm looking at things, there's integrative pain care, right? Which covers a whole bunch of things. Then there's trauma-informed pain care. Then there's trauma-informed care, and there's trauma-focused care. Help us unpack, well, we can do it together because there's a lot of terms here, but help us unpack how you approach these topics and how you conceptualize them in your practice.
So for me, I conceptualize trauma-focused physical therapy as a mental health physiotherapy service that's aimed to directly address or treat the physical, psychological, and social effects of psychological trauma and ongoing stress within the unique knowledge, skills, and abilities that we have as a physical therapist. So staying within our scope of practice. And it is a new conceptualization. There's a few research articles out there integrating, including one that I contributed to, but it hasn't been formally conceptualized. So I feel like a lot of it is an ongoing process, which is exciting, but can also feel a little
it's very new. Yeah, it because people feel they lose a sense of groundedness when they hear things like this, because oftentimes if it wasn't learned in school, then they have no reference point of kind of where this comes from. So you come in with this, wonderfully needed and excellent conceptualization of trauma-focused physical therapy, but then people hear words like psychological, and I believe you said spiritual, potentially even, and people say, "Whoa, what is that? That's not what I'm doing, and that's not what I do. This wasn't what I was trained to do." Where does that fit, and how does that fit? So how have you started to take, as you mentioned, the skills and tools that we have as professionals and start to build that out into a trauma-focused physical therapy intervention?
So I think one thing is laying the foundation of the biopsychosocial spiritual approach, because if you're a physical therapist that is embodying that, then the trauma focused skills can come from that, right? Or if you're also integrating the modern pain science or integrative pain approach, a lot of that foundation is the same. Because if we think about the physiological changes that happen in the nervous system with trauma, what happens from that is persistent pain, central sensitization, experiences of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and all the problems with functioning. It's all has a physiological underpinning, right? So it's really, once you understand that and you can hold that, then it's quite easy to see how you can approach it, I think.
Right. Because instead of just approaching trauma from being a psychological diagnosis, so to speak, and once we label something, and trauma is a DSM-5 diagnosis, so it obviously is in the realm of psychology, but really what you're saying is there are cognitive processes or changes that are impacted with trauma. Those need to be addressed and treated. There are also physiological or bodily changes that happen with trauma, and those also need to be attended to and addressed. And a lot of the skills and tools we have as physical therapists or physiotherapists can help with the reprocessing of trauma and the recovery of trauma.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the physiological changes, if we say, okay, as a physical therapist, I'm comfortable, I can address physiological changes. Well, those physiological changes is what creates social effects, right? That affects someone's social functioning. It's what creates emotional effects from trauma, right? So we are inherently addressing the social, physical, emotional, and spiritual by focusing on physiological changes.
So let's kind of dig down to this a little bit deeper so people understand. So can you give us an example? So give us an example of a trauma symptom, so to speak, that's in the body, right? Is physiological in nature. And then connect for us how that physiologic symptom impacts someone. Because you said social function. You didn't even say cognitive function. You said social function, which the way I'm kind of reading into that is someone's bodily experience or their physiology has the potential to impact how they function in the world or how they function in their environment.
Yeah, so I think of a client I worked with recently who is a survivor of trauma, a lot of economic hardship, ongoing stress, presents with persistent pain for years, primarily back pain, and has been to, just like a lot of folks in the US, lots of doctors, diagnosing them with a variety of different things in their back. A lot of strong beliefs about their back, about their diagnoses they have. And so how that was playing out in their daily life is and how we can think about it from a social perspective is they were no longer playing with their kids. So they couldn't get on and off the floor to play with their kids anymore, right? They weren't being physically active. They couldn't do the roles and responsibilities that were theirs within their social ecosystem and their community. And so you have the persistent pain aspect, but if you think of the bigger trauma, the trauma is sensitizing their nervous system, creating changes in their nervous system that from that you have persistent pain, but you also have social effects that are not related to the pain. It's related to heightened fear, heightened threat response, related to sleep problems, right? That is all coming from these physiological changes, and then everything's interwebbed into each other, right? So you're going to then have social, emotional interactions between those.
There definitely are a lot of there are a lot of things that sustain both trauma and pain, so they become so similar in so many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when you're living in an ongoing stressful environment, like it's not possible to always take the stress away, right? Or to take the source of the trauma that's ongoing away. So it is, but we can, as physical therapists, create changes in the person's body and in their nervous system that allows them to interact in a more functional way within that.
Right, because the people you're working with potentially are embedded within a socio-cultural context of where the precipitating trauma is not necessarily removed, or it may only be removed for certain times.
Correct. So I work with a lot of people in prisons. So the prison environment is inherently traumatic, or people with refugee experiences. And even in the US, people who are living in communities where there's poverty, the ongoing gun violence, experiences of racism and oppression and marginalization, experiences of lack of access of healthcare for the queer community, right? So many of us are living in this ongoing state of stress and trauma.
Indeed, both in the US and outside the US. Tell us, what kind of skills do you think a physical therapist needs to start to engage in this kind of work?
So I think there's quite a lot. So maybe what I could do is I can list some, and then if there's some that you kind of want to dive into, like we can talk more about it. So I think for the assessment and treatment, it's really rooted in a biopsychosocial spiritual approach and all the skills that come with that, as well as goal setting and value setting based on maybe more on the ACT theory way of doing things, modern pain science, interdisciplinary work, an inherent understanding and application of post-traumatic growth and strength-based approach. Culturally responsive care is also very important. And then some concepts, some skills and treatments around arousal regulation, body awareness. And then another important one for me personally, but also generally, is that the provider works through their own experiences of trauma so that they can then show up and create a safe space for the clients, and develop that therapeutic relationship, and that your own personal trauma doesn't influence that in an unhelpful way.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. And that's one that we have not started to really approach yet in our profession. If you go into many mental health training programs, sometimes they will require that you receive 7 or 8 sessions of therapy first to start to examine your own life and your own life experiences and how that could potentially inform the work that you're doing as a licensed professional. It's really interesting to me because I used to do hiring for a long time. I hired physical therapists, and in those interview processes, always somewhere comes out, well, I wanted to become a physical therapist because, I sustained an injury, car accident, or I tore my ACL playing a sport, or my grandfather had a stroke and I was the primary, provider, so to speak. And, within that, of course, are our own experiences as humans and as, potential and future professionals, our own trauma experiences in some way, right? Our own experiences of what it was like to test our own resiliency. And then to have to learn how to grow within that entire context. But we don't really necessarily, as a profession, before we go into practice, start to reflect upon how our previous life experiences could potentially impact the person in front of us, including our biases.
Exactly. Yeah. I think I've learned a lot from the mental health community from that, right? And even the concept of clinical supervision that's ongoing as a professional is common practice in mental health, but in physical therapy, that's not common practice, right? Like even after your first year, you might not even still have clinical supervision, and a clinical supervision approach that's not just embedded in, what treatment planning or clinical decision making, but also, like you said, your biases. How are you responding to this person? What are you bringing into that treatment space? How are you creating a justice and equitable treatment interaction for each client?
Talk to me about justice. That's a term that is coming up more and more in the literature. They're both in kind of the workers' comp, pain management world, but also in many other aspects of healthcare, how people have feelings of justice or injustice potentially, and how that impacts their belief systems and their engagement with care. Talk to us about justice, because a lot of your work really intersects with justice almost at every moment of the day.
Yeah, I also identify myself as a justice-centered physical therapist. So what I hope is that, and the way I move in the world as a physical therapist, but also just as a human, is justice-centered, which how I describe that is it's working towards a world where the systematic causes of health disparities or health injustices are removed. So where all people have equitable and just opportunities for health, wellness, and function. And if I think of myself working in a trauma-focused space, it is inherently irresponsible for me to only be providing treatment for survivors of trauma without also taking responsibility for the systems and the experiences that are causing the trauma. So for me, not only do I want to work downstream, which is the idea of, working to provide treatment and rehab services, I also want to work upstream to stop the traumatic experiences from happening, to contribute to changes in our political, academic, health systems, so those traumatic experiences no longer happen, and we don't have oppression anymore.
Yeah, it's such a great question. The idea of injustice within the system came up recently when I was interacting with another professional who kind of has been on a similar path that you've been on, looking more into working with women who are suffering with trauma in a pelvic health practice, and starting to explore all the kind of different types of trauma-informed, psychologically informed courses that are out there. And the question she had for me was, how do I start to change the practice I work in? She was really kind of working in more of a ortho sports practice that also had a little bit of this kind of they're bringing in the women's health component, so to speak. So that was really her place. And she was having kind of a hard time fitting into the practice and the systems of the practice, if you will. Because as she started to learn more about things like ACT and trauma-informed care, she noticed that she started to change. And we talked about this a lot. And, at the end of, this conversation we had, which probably occurred over about a month or two, she said, I don't think I can fit into this system because this system is actually persisting and causing trauma potentially in some people and some patients. And I think right now, I think it's something that a lot of physical therapists, especially in the United States, are starting to become aware of, because they're aware of the neuroscience of pain and how that starts to intersect with the neuroscience of trauma. And then they start to look at what they're doing and the systems that they work in. They're saying, I don't know if I can actually change this. I think I might have to leave it or completely scrap it and start something all over again. And those are difficult places for professionals to find themselves in.
Yeah, I really feel that. The US healthcare system is doing what it was designed to do, right? It is doing what it's designed to do. It's oppressing, it's creating health inequities. Like the system is designed for that. So I completely feel with the people who feel like I can't work within the system anymore. And I see a lot of physical therapists and colleagues in the US working outside of it now, right? Trying to reimagine how can we provide community-centered, justice-centered healthcare, and they're not doing it within the healthcare system, in the healthcare insurance system. They're creating their own organic services. And I think also I have a lot of privilege in Kurdistan because we inherently have a lot more freedom. Like we can develop healthcare services, not that are actually just relevant for whatever is needed by the community. It's relevant for the physical therapist. So for example, we can create documentation that is clinically relevant for the physical therapist and for the community, because we don't have to report to an insurance company. Right. So what I hope is that as physical therapists, for example, in the US and globally, we can work to reimagine what a healthcare services and physical therapy services can be and take steps to really make it happen.
Yeah. And a mental health approach to physical therapy is definitely, as you mentioned, a big part of that.
Yeah, I always feel very like when I come to the US and I'm hanging out in physical therapy circles and I try to, people like at a CSM conference, right? They're like, oh, what do you do? And I say mental health, physical therapy, and they just like zone out because they don't even know how to conceptualize. They don't even know what questions to ask because it's been so isolated from the physical therapy profession, especially in the US context. Yeah. So I hope, seems like there's some movement to bring that in, but it's going to take some time.
So with the flexibility that you encounter because you're working overseas and you're not at the mercy of an insurance company, you've also started to create some really unique interventions of your own, kind of based a little bit in pain science, but really starting to bring in a lot of other things. Can you tell us a little bit about that program you've created?
Yeah, so there's maybe two I'll highlight. So one is I work with Buchan Organization for Victims of Human Rights Violations. So they're a local Kurdish NGO in Suleimania, Kurdistan. And so there we've created together a physical therapy group treatment service that goes along with counseling group treatment for survivors of trauma and torture within a prison. And so that does embed a lot of pain education, therapeutic neuroscience education, body awareness practices, arousal regulation, sleep, and then it all is embedded in the trauma recovery model, which is a way of framing clinical treatment services for survivors of trauma. And we've done a research study for that, a pilot study to show the outcomes. So that's one example.
So if I heard you right in the delivery, there's a component that's delivered by a mental health provider, and there's a component that's obviously delivered by you. The component you mentioned
well, actually not myself, the Kurdish physical therapists.
Okay,
they do it.
So you train someone to deliver this, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the people, the therapists, the physical therapists that are delivering this, what does it look like? Because you're obviously going beyond just traditional physical therapy and body-oriented techniques. Sounds like there's more of psychoeducational component to this?
So if you were a client in the session, what you would see is you'd come to a session, there'd be about 8 to 12 clients with you, 2 physical therapists facilitating the group together. And each session, there is progression that is inherently happens over about 10 to 12 group treatment sessions, but each session has so regulation techniques, maybe breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness, body scan. There is education, but an interactive education, especially within that group setting, that's a lot focused on pain neuroscience education. And then there's movement. So there's often movements that are aerobic exercise, because we know the research shows how supportive that is for experiences of pain and other effects of trauma. Also, like basic body awareness therapy, inspired movements, and we integrate a lot of play and social interaction within all the movements and exercises that we do. And then I think, we progress it along. And then I think another important aspect is we have the whole session 10 is reflecting on the changes that they've experienced physically, emotionally, socially, and looking towards the future about how they want to maintain those and celebrating what they've done, which is, I think, an important aspect.
So this occurs over 10 sessions.
Correct. 10 group sessions, with an assessment and a post-assessment and an individual session in the middle as well.
And how long is each session approximately?
About 90 minutes.
Okay. So you have a nice chunk of time with people.
And then in parallel, the clients would also have group counseling.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd have 2 sessions a week, a group counseling and a group physical therapy.
So the pain neuroscience aspect, the therapeutic pain science, a lot of PTs understand what that is. You mentioned basic body awareness therapy, which is a term most US-based physical therapists probably have not heard of. Can you just give us a kind of idea of what that is?
I'm probably not going to use the right words that a basic body awareness therapist would use, because they can be quite specific.
Yeah.
But how I conceptualize it is a framework to approaching movements that can be quite different than how we approach movement, maybe in the US context, that recognizes body awareness, that integrates a lot of guided imagery, a lot of cognitive processes to your movement. And there are, like, basic body awareness therapy is a very well-studied exercise intervention, and you can probably speak to it more too, Joe. And there are a series of movements that you can do, like there's structured specific movements that you can do in that. And also our physical therapists in Kurdistan have created kind of BBAT inspired movements that are specific to the culture. So they use a lot of cultural specific movements as well.
Yeah, well said. Those types of therapies really came out of the Northern European countries and took root there, but it really has never taken root here in the US. And I think it's because mental health physical therapy is more accepted there versus in the US. I think there's a stigma around it, actually, that all of us, including, you and I here today, are kind of working to start to undo that stigma. And the idea that physical therapists can play a role in mental health, and that in many ways we have therapies that are already created, that are studied, that help people with mental and behavioral health treatments.
Exactly.
Where would you like to see this go? Because obviously the work you're doing, and it's so interesting for me to just speak with you today and to think the scary thought that I had is that someone actually has to leave a colleague of mine has to leave the United States of America, right? One of the wealthiest, most educated countries potentially in the world as far as healthcare goes, right? And especially us with our quote unquote DPTs, has to leave the country, go to another, what people would identify as a third world, war-torn, poverty-stricken culture, to develop an evidence-based biopsychosocial approach that's trauma-focused, that can be delivered by physical therapists. I mean, it kind of just blows my mind.
Yeah, that's fair. And I want to highlight too that, I'm not the only one developing it. I'm working with the community in Kurdistan and the greater Middle East, North African region to create these treatment approaches. inspired by evidence, but like you said, we just, as a physical therapy profession, we don't have what I feel like and what I witness communities asking for and needing right now. So what I hope is that maybe you all can in America can learn from what we're doing, right? And learn from what, for example, like you said, the Northern European, and start to, really take those and apply them in the US context.
So I spoke at the Educational Leadership Conference, which was in Milwaukee, which is the educational kind of conference for DPT educators. And the first day I happened to wander into a room where the president of the APTA, our current president, a really great guy, was speaking on a panel with a couple other physical therapists. And they were actually talking about exactly what you mentioned, that communities are out there and they're looking for us to engage with them. And obviously, when you have to go out into a community and engage with a community instead of an individual, it's a very different experience. And it also, in my opinion, requires very different skills and knowledge. And they were talking about kind of the opportunities as well as the challenges. And part of my brain always goes to like the challenges first, like, why can't we do this? Like, why has it been difficult for us to do this as a profession? And one of the things that I proposed to the president of the American Physical Therapy Association was that we might consider or reconsider how we position ourselves as movement experts. Because in some way, that may be we may be stigmatizing ourselves as the only thing we can do is movement. And people see movement as exercise, as kind of fitness, basically. So it starts to kind of go down that road. And I said, maybe we should be behavioral health experts or movement and behavioral health experts. And the panel was kind of like 50-50 because there were 4 people on the panel. 2 people thought it was great, and 2 people kind of were confused by what I was saying, and they weren't quite getting it. And really, I think a lot of what your work points to is that for us to engage with the community and the challenges that they're having, we really need a broader skill set embedded within a movement system approach.
Yeah, I really feel what you're saying. And I think a couple of things come to my mind. Is one, we need a lot of skills to engage with communities in a non-harmful way. And that shouldn't be taken lightly and just like, go engage with the community, because we will inherently cause harm if we do it without skills. And
so talk to me what you mean by that, because people, for the most part, professionals are well-intentioned and well-meaning, but when you start to enter into communities that need help and support, how could we inadvertently, or how do we have decreased awareness that we could potentially cause more harm than good, or cause some harm while at the same time promoting some good?
So I think it is really important to understand the historical lens through where we are, that healthcare has always been founded on a power differential, that the healthcare provider, the physical therapist, is given more power than the community and the client. And when there is a power difference, usually the person in power does not notice. They don't feel that, right? They're like, oh, and they also will bring these unhealthy narratives like, I'm here to help, I can save, I can fix. And then the person who is less power in that relationship then is not able to actually share what they need, because communities, maybe they don't need physical therapy, right? Like, we don't need to come into with the assumption that they need physical therapy, especially the way that we're doing it right now, right? So communities have strengths, resources, ways of doing things, ways of working with persistent pain outside of a medical system, right? So the skill is allowing the community to direct us. And that takes a lot of personal skill development around your positions of privilege and your interaction style. That's probably too long to go into here. So I think it's more just to emphasize, to pause and ask people and get support and mentorship if you want to move into that direction.
Right, because the communities that really need our help, especially in the world of pain management, are Black, Indigenous people of color, the elderly, children, LGBTQ plus communities, women.
But maybe
And-
not need our help. They might not. We don't
Right.
know, right?
However, most of us are all trained in a system that's led by white, male, cisgender, homonormative men, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as a white person living in a country like Kurdistan, like I constantly am thinking about my position of power and privilege and my whiteness and how that affects how I show up in spaces.
Yeah. And it's tough in the pain world.
Mm.
And it's a topic in the pain world that we haven't really started to unpack as deep as we need to.
I think
What would your
the other thing that came out when you were talking about your experience with the APTA discussion is you asked, why are we not able to do that right now? And I think some of it is the emphasis in the US culture and the physical therapy culture of productivity, right? And what do we value? What do our actions value, show that we value? Well, right now we value making money, we value billing, and it's very hard for a physical therapist to ask their employer, hey, can I have 10 hours a week to work on justice and work on community-centered services? Employers don't get that, right? So I think that's a huge culture shift we have to change. Otherwise, we won't have space to create, to reimagine, to reinvent.
Right. There's no flexibility built into the current system in many places. Or to find that flexibility really takes a lot of work and trying to figure out, okay, how can I muscle this into a certain part of care? Whereas you said before, sometimes people get frustrated and they say, hey, I'm just going to go build my own system or build my own plan of care, so to speak, which is not a bad thing. But the unfortunate part is, I think in the United States, what happens is therapists then take those skills and they go to wealthy communities that have the money to pay for the service, but it doesn't wind up being embedded into the communities that really need it and really deserving of it.
Yeah, true. We also need to reinvent a sustainable financial approach.
Yeah.
And that's also something I'm considering in Kurdistan, is how do we create a physical therapy and rehab system that doesn't rely on external humanitarian money, right? Like we're trying to reinvent that now because it's not sustainable for us.
April, it's been great speaking with you today. I really admire not only the work that you're doing. I think it's desperately needed both, of course, around the world, but even within some people's hometowns here in the US. So I think people are going to be interested to learn more about you and your work. How can they reach out to you and how can they follow you?
So I don't really do social media. So you can email me. My email is april.dpt@gmail.com. And then if you're interested, you can also check out the resource myself and a group of physical therapists developed from the Middle East, North African region called Beyond Pain. It's freely accessible, downloaded. It's in English, Arabic, and Kurdish. And it is a training and treatment manual that embeds trauma-focused physical therapy concepts, included in a lot of modern pain, as it's designed for people with pain.
Great. And we'll, of course, include all those links on the show notes at the Integrative Pain Science Institute, including the link to Beyond Pain. So you can download that and check it out. April's email will also be there. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me and I'll connect you with April. At the end of every episode, I ask you to share this with your friends and colleagues. Of course, this is important to share with your physical therapy and physiotherapy colleagues who are interested in pain-informed, trauma-focused, trauma-informed, and mental health physical therapy, which will be on the rise and on the increase, definitely, as we move into 2023 and beyond. So make sure to share this with them on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or you can tag me on Instagram and I'll tag you back and share this information. I'm Dr. Joe Tatta. It's been great being here with you today, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. To subscribe to the podcast and learn more, visit integrativepainscienceinstitute.com. That's Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. Sign up to receive weekly updates, leave a review on iTunes, and share this episode with your friends.